Our next speaker is someone who's at the top of the list when we talk about new age politicians. He was a pioneer in using social media as an instrument of political interaction. Till 2013, he was the most followed politician on Twitter, and today he has almost 4 million followers. Currently a second-term Lok Sabha Member of Parliament, representing the Thiruvananthapuram constituency and chairman of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs, he has previously served as Minister of State for Human Resource Development, Minister of State for External Affairs in the Government of India. During his nearly 3-decade-long prior career at the UN, he served as a peacekeeper, refugee worker, and administrator at the highest levels, serving as Under Secretary General during Kofi Annan's leadership of the organization. He is an award-winning author of 15 books of both fiction as well as non-fiction. Please welcome Dr. Shashi Tharoor.
Thank you, Sean, and great to see you all here. Sorry, I was just trying to send a message, which I'm afraid hasn't gone, so I think that means that those seats can probably be now released. People who want to claim them are not going to get it. Okay. So, great to see you all. This has been a terrific conference. I've caught glimpses of some of the other sessions, and it's been really stimulating. It's always a pleasure to address and interact with such an eclectic assembly of bright minds in one place. And what I wanted to talk about, or what I've been asked to talk about, is the soft power of India. You know, whenever India is talked about in these conferences where our country is celebrated, the tendency is to exaggerate our conventional power, our economic growth, all of those factors. I remember the American publishers of my 2007 book, The Elephant, the Tiger, and the Cell Phone, added a gratuitous subtitle suggesting that my volume was about the emerging 21st century power. And of course, in India, people didn't even shy clear of the superpower word, which I found, frankly, cringe-making, and I attracted one of my many controversies by saying, how can we be a superpower when we are still super poor? But the fact is that, that the question of what India is going to count for in the world has been, to a great extent, exaggerated and blown out of proportion by ourselves, by our own boosting of our undoubted potential. And I tend, without wanting to disparage the country, because as you know, I am amongst the boosters myself, but I tend to say that the only thing on which we're going to actually be a world leader is in population, because according to the UN demographers, we will overtake China to become the world's most populous country in 2026. And about 10 years ago, that estimate was for 2034. So we are certainly on course to top the charts. But short of that, we really are number one in anything else, except, as I'm about to argue, I think in many ways, perhaps the most important aspect of India's resurgence in the world is indeed the quality, the attribute of our soft power. Now, what does that mean? What is power, after all? Power is essentially the ability to get other people to do what you want them to do. And usually that means using muscle, using the danda, telling somebody, if you don't do this, I'm going to bash you up or whatever. So the classic use of power, hard power, is that of sticks, if you like, coercion. There's also a second well-known attribute of conventional power, and that is inducements, payments, cash. If you have great economic strength, you can induce other countries to behave as you want them to, through economic aid, through simply their desire not to get on the wrong side of a rich country, and therefore carrots are the second example. The sticks come from your military power, the carrots come from your economic power. But as Joseph Nye, who of course developed his theory at the JFK School of Government in Harvard about 25 years ago, memorably put it, There is a third kind of power, and that is the power of attraction. And he said if you develop that power, then you can economize on the sticks and the carrots. And that is what he described as soft power. Now, the interesting thing about that idea is that until Nye had put it in such clear terms, essentially hard power was the only power that strategists and scholars thought about and wrote about. Basically, the assumption was the side with the larger army and the most money is going to win. But in fact, that wasn't always true in the second half of the 20th century. We have example after example. The US lost the Vietnam War. The Soviet Union was humbled by a motley bunch of mujahideen in Afghanistan. And even after the end of the Cold War, when the US became the world's sole superpower, they discovered in Iraq, after winning the conventional war and taking Baghdad, the wisdom of the French statesman Talleyrand's famous adage that the one thing you cannot do with a bayonet is to sit on it. So having the power was all very good. You couldn't rule a fractious country with that. So that's where soft power comes in, both as an alternative to hard power and as a complement to it. To quote Nye, the soft power of a country rests principally on three resources: its culture, in places where it's attractive to others, its political values, when it lives up to them at home and abroad, and its foreign policies, when they are seen as legitimate and having moral authority, unquote. So that's Nye, and I great respect and admiration for Nye and his thinking on all of this. I'd go slightly beyond, though. For me, a country's soft power emerges from the world's perceptions of what that country is all about. The associations and attitudes conjured up in the global imagination by the mere mention of a country's name is often a more accurate gauge of its soft power than a dispassionate analysis of its foreign policies. In my view, hard power is exercised. Soft power is evoked. Now, before we get to India, let's accept that, as Nye rightly put it, the US is the archetypal exponent of soft power. The US is, after all, the home of Boeing and Intel, Google and the iPod and the iPhone, Microsoft and MTV, Hollywood and Disneyland, Coke and jeans, McDonald's and Starbucks, in short, of most of the major products that dominate daily life around our globe. The attractiveness of those assets and of the American lifestyle of which they're emblematic is that they permit the US to persuade others to adopt the US's agenda rather than relying purely on the dissuasive or coercive power, hard power of military force. Now, this can cut both ways, because in a world of instant mass communications enabled by the internet, countries are increasingly judged by a global public that's fed all the time on an incessant diet of internet news, of televised images, videos taken on the cell phones of passers-by, email gossip, memes coming to you on WhatsApp. All of these things are also feeding perceptions and images. And we've seen, for example, America, despite being, if you like, the classic embodiment of soft power, when 9/11 happened and the whole world turned to America in sympathy, even a staunch left-of-center critic like Le Monde had a famous headline saying, "We are all Americans now." And then within a few years, that soft power advantage, if you like, of being this admired, respected, loved democracy melted away as you suddenly saw the instruments of American hard power, the Iraq invasion, Guantanamo Bay, Abu Ghraib, Blackwater killing Iraqi civilians, and suddenly the hard power's success undermined the soft power. And this is the challenge. You can often find that soft power is great but is inadequate to compensate for the deficiencies of hard power, because fans of American culture are not necessarily going to overlook the excesses of Guantanamo. Using Microsoft Windows or wearing jeans doesn't necessarily predispose you in favor of extraordinary rendition. So the misuse of hard power can also undermine your soft power around the world. But anyway, I'm not here to talk about the US. I mention this because, of course, we have to take the principles behind all this to India. And in his book, The Paradox of American Power, Joseph Nye admitted that, this is something which can go beyond America. And he talked about 3 types of countries that, in his view, could gain soft power. And I'm going to quote again, but while he's writing about the world in general, think about India and see how interestingly his theory applies. He says these 3 types are those whose dominant cultures and ideals are closer to global prevailing norms, which now emphasize liberalism, pluralism, and autonomy. So that's one category of country. India fits. Those with the most access to multiple channels of communication and thus more influence over how issues are framed. Well, who has access to more multiple channels of communication outside the West anyway than India? And third, those whose credibility is enhanced by their domestic and international performance. There one can debate it, but India's been doing pretty well as well. So, while at first glance his quote, this what I've just summarized of the 3 types of countries, seems a prescription for underscoring American dominance and soft power, you've got to accept that soft power actually can be practiced and has been practiced by others. The example I love to give is when the French were clobbered by the Prussians in the War of 1870. What did they do when the Germans withdrew and the Prussians withdrew? First thing the French did was to create the Alliance Française. So we can't win the military war, we will use French culture to spread our influence around the globe. And that was, of course, has remained a major calling point for French diplomacy ever since. And other countries do this. The UK has a British Council, the Swiss have Pro-Helvetia, Germany, Spain, Italy, Portugal have all got institutes named for Goethe, Cervantes, Dante Alighieri, and Camões. And today, China has started establishing Confucius Institutes to promote Chinese culture internationally. The Beijing Olympics were nothing more than a sustained exercise in building up Chinese soft power. The US itself has officially sponsored initiatives, right? From the Voice of America to the Fulbright scholarships. But the point is that soft power doesn't rely purely on governmental action. In fact, arguably for the US, Hollywood and MTV have done far more to promote the idea of America as a desirable and admirable society than either the Voice of America or the Fulbright scholarships or any other American governmental endeavor. Soft power is created partly by governments and partly despite governments, partly by deliberate action and partly by accident. Now, I say this because this is what has happened with India. The fact is that the roots of India's soft power run deep, and they precede the government. Indeed, they precede independence. India's is a civilization that over millennia has offered refuge and, more important, religious and cultural freedom to Jews, to Parsis, to several varieties of Christians and Muslims. As we know, Jews came to the southwestern Indian coast, Kerala today, centuries before Christ. Oral legend says when the Babylonians destroyed their first temple. Certainly there's more confirmation after the destruction of the second temple by the Romans. And there's a lovely story of how when St. Thomas the Apostle, doubting Thomas of the Bible, landed on the shores of Kerala, he was welcomed on shore by a flute-playing Jewish girl. And what was striking is, of course, this Jewish community is the only example of a Jewish diaspora in global history that never knew a single episode of anti-Semitism. And this is, again, part of India's strength. The Christians came, converted people to the point where there are, as you know, large populations of Indian Christians whose ancestors were Christian far before any European, any white person ever discovered Christianity. Islam came to South India, to Kerala in particular, by traders, travelers, and missionaries, and not by the sword, as is popularly talked about in the north. In fact, the Zamorin of Calicut, one of our kings, actually was so enamored of the seafaring skills of the Muslim community, the Kunyali Marikars, that he actually decreed that every fisherman's family in his kingdom would have to bring up one son as a Muslim, because he believed only Muslims could sail properly, and he wanted an all-Muslim navy. The India, which welcomed the Parsis to Gujarat, again, many of you know that story. though it's more to the credit of the Parsis than the Gujaratis at that time, because when they showed up in a few ships off the coast of Gujarat, the local king decided he didn't want these refugees taking up space on his land, so he sent an envoy. And of course, they didn't have any language in common, so the envoy, to explain that the land was too crowded for the Parsis to come in, took a glass of water and dropped a stone in it, and the water overflowed the glass. So he was trying to show that there isn't enough room for you. And the Parsi captain asked him to wait and summoned a glass of milk and gently stirred a spoonful of sugar into it to show that not only would the liquid not overflow, it would become sweeter. But these are all stories of assimilation, integration, acceptance and accommodation, and that's the point I'm trying to make. The India where in my Calcutta neighborhood in my high school years, the wail of the muezzin calling the Islamic faithful to prayer would literally blend with the tinkling of the bells, chanting the mantras at the Shiva temple at the corner, which in turn was competing with the loudspeakers outside the Sikh Gurudwara reciting verses from the Granth Sahib, and just around the corner was St. Paul's Cathedral. That was Calcutta, but that is India. That, to my mind, that is the India that we can all celebrate as a nation whose soft power roots go right into the heart and depth of its civilizational history. The British historian E.P. Thompson wrote in the 1980s that this heritage of diversity is what makes India, and I quote, perhaps the most important country for the future of the world. All the convergent influences of the world run through this society. There is not a thought that is being thought in the West or the East that is not active in some Indian mind, unquote. I'm glad a Brit said that and not an Indian. But the fact is that this Indian mind has been shaped by remarkably diverse forces, ancient Hindu tradition, myth, and scripture, the impact of Islam and Christianity, and 2 centuries of British colonial rule, which has given me the language in which I'm addressing you today. The result is unique. Though there are some who advocate the idea of India as a Hindu country, Indian civilization today is clearly an evolved hybrid. We cannot speak of Indian culture today without Qawwali, the poetry of Ghalib, or for that matter, the game of cricket, none of which can be found in the Vedas, right? When an Indian dons national dress for a formal event, as you have to when the great and the good come visiting, the Indian male will be wearing a variant of the sherwani, which of course did not exist in India before the Muslim invasions. And when Indian Hindus voted in 2007 in a rather cynical and contrived internet exercise to elect the new 7 wonders of the modern world, what did the vast majority of Indian internet users vote for? They voted for the Taj Mahal, the legacy of a Muslim Mughal king, which happens to be on Indian soil, rather than perhaps the greatest, arguably the greatest and most magnificent architectural product of the Hindu religion, the Angkor Wat temple, which happens to be in a foreign country. So what is the idea of India? Is it reducible to a religion? In the breadth and not just the depth of its cultural heritage lies the sources of India's soft power. Now, I can go on about this, but I have done so in so many speeches elsewhere that I am not going to belabor the point of Indian pluralism, other than to stress that it's a reality that emerges from the very nature of our country, a choice made inevitable, perhaps by India's geography, but one that's been reaffirmed by our history. The whole idea of our diversity is that we are in many ways all minorities in India, that you can be many things and one thing. You can be a good Muslim, a good Keralite, and a good Indian all at once. So the idea of India is of one land embracing many. It's the idea, in fact the phrase is Tagore's, that a nation may endure differences of caste, creed, color, culture, cuisine, conviction, costume, and custom, and still rally around a consensus. And that consensus is on the simple idea that in a diverse democracy like ours, you don't really need to agree all the time, so long as you will agree on the ground rules of how you will disagree. To my mind, one of the reasons we've survived so many of the stresses and strains that have beset us as a country is that we've maintained consensus on how to manage without consensus. So All of this is relevant because the world of the 21st century will increasingly be a world in which the use of hard power will bring with it the odium of mass public disapproval in world affairs. Whereas the blossoming of soft power, which lends itself far more easily to the information era, will constitute a country's principal asset. And soft power, as you know, is not about conquering others, but about being yourself and capturing the hearts and minds of others in so doing. Countries are increasingly judged by the soft power elements they project on the global consciousness. And you can do that, as I said earlier, either deliberately or unwittingly. Now, we produce various kinds of culture that add up to contributing to our soft power. One of the most obvious examples are the films of Bollywood, now reaching ever wider international audiences. And it didn't take the Oscar triumph of Slumdog Millionaire for Bollywood to have made its mark and for its brand of entertainment to seduce hearts and minds in many parts of the globe. Certainly in Africa and the Arab world, Bollywood has been a hugely popular product. I have met so many African foreign ministers and even heads of state and government who've told me of looking forward in their childhood to the arrival of the Bollywood film in the nearest town to where they were growing up. A friend of mine in New York, a Senegalese gentleman, told me about his illiterate mother who takes a bus to the capital city of Dakar from her village once a month just to watch a Bollywood film. Now, she is obviously not able to understand a single line of dialogue. She's illiterate, so she can't read the French subtitles, but our films are made to be understood despite such handicaps. And she watches the song and dance and action and goes away with stars in her eyes about India as a result. An Indian diplomat friend stationed in Damascus some years ago before the Civil War told me that in those days the only portraits in the whole of Damascus that were allowed to be displayed as large as those of the then President Hafiz al-Assad were portraits of Amitabh Bachchan. So this is a huge, huge asset for us. I can go on again with more examples of this, but that's Bollywood, and there's Indian art, music, classical dance, which have a similar effect. Indian fashion designers' products are striding across the world's catwalks. Indian cuisine, rising our stock higher around the world. In fact, the French have long known that the way to foreigners' hearts is through their palates. Well, the proliferation of Indian restaurants around the world has raised consciousness of India astonishingly. In fact, in England today, Indian curry houses, as they're called, Indian restaurants, occupy so much of the public consciousness that chicken tikka masala has been declared the national dish by a British Foreign Secretary. And these restaurants employ more people than the iron and steel, coal mining, and shipbuilding industries combined. So the empire can strike back. Now, it's true that some in India worried about the insidious dangers of globalization. They're terrified that Baywatch and burgers are going to supplant Bharatnatyam and Bhelpuri. But the fact is, of course, that India's experience with Western consumer products has actually demonstrated that we can drink Coca-Cola without becoming Coca-colonized. The truth is that Mahatma Gandhi came up with a perfect metaphor 80 years ago, 70-odd years ago, when he said that India will not be any less India if it's a house with all the doors and windows open, so the winds of the world can blow through it, so long as we are strong enough to stand on our own feet and not be blown off by these winds. And that ultimately is the strength. Our popular culture has proved resilient enough to face and stand up to globalization. Masala doshas have continued to outsell McDonald's, and of course Bollywood to outdo Burger King. The strength of Indianness has lain in our ability to absorb foreign influences and transform these foreign influences by particularly Indian alchemy into something that belongs naturally on the soil of India. So whether we're exporting Bollywood or Bhangra, we are now a player in globalization, not merely a subject of it. And we are able to do this from the products of both the past and the future. When I speak of the past, the obvious example, I think our Consul General mentioned it yesterday at dinner, is yoga. where the adoption by the UN of the International Day of Yoga has meant that we have, in fact, managed to persuade 150-odd countries to celebrate an Indian custom, at least one day a year in their national capitals. Ayurveda is also growing in the same way. I was in Colombia as a minister, and the president of Colombia told me that the one thing he wanted to see more of in his country were Ayurveda practitioners, and could India ship over a few? I'm sure they've managed to go and establish themselves by now. But then that's the past. What about the future? Well, IT has led the way. After all, today, I think it's fair to say that Americans in Silicon Valley speak of the IITs with the same reverence that they accord to MIT. And that has created a situation where the Indianness of engineers and software developers is taken as synonymous with mathematical and scientific excellence. Inevitably, this means that India gains in respect. It's also part of our soft power. Mind you, the stereotypes that have changed as I came here to this country as a graduate student in 1975, and at that point, the classic image of India was fakirs lying on beds of nails, snake charmers doing the Indian rope trick, and of course, if they really wanted it to be complimentary, would be turbaned and bejeweled Maharajas sitting on caparisoned elephants. But that apart, that was India. Today, it's every Indian must be a computer geek or a software engineer. And this gives you this sort of lesson in unintended consequences, because a friend of mine who, like me, I think was a history major, found himself accosted one day by an anxiously perspiring white guy at a European airport saying, you're Indian, can you help me fix my laptop? So the notion that we have these particular qualities is again something that has transformed the image of India around the world. Now, one can go on. I mean, we are seeing example after example of Indian innovation. Chanda Kochar was asked about Indian innovation. But you Google frugal innovation, and the first 20 results will all deal with Indian inventions. And even a product like the Tata Nano, which in India is seen as a marketing disaster, globally is seen as a masterpiece of no-frills engineering by world-class standards, took the Geneva Auto Salon by storm. And of course, many of you will have received or perhaps passed on that wonderful internet meme last summer of the British Prime Minister driving off to Buckingham Palace to claim his second mandate after his re-election in, as the Indians gleefully pointed out, an Indian-owned car, the Jaguar, escorted by police in another Indian-owned car, a Land Rover. So if that didn't send a post-colonial frisson through you, let me tell you about the time when the ancestors of Mr. Tata, Jamshedji Tata, tried to set up India's first ever steel mill back in 1905, and did so in the teeth of implacable British hostility. A senior imperial official actually sneered that he would personally eat every ounce of steel that an Indian was capable of producing. Well, it's a pity he didn't live long enough to see the descendants of Mr. Tata, Jamshedji Tata, acquire the remnants of British steel when they bought Chorus a few years ago. Might have given him a bad case of indigestion. Anyway, I tell these stories to say that India is changing its stock and the world is changing. Joseph Nye has also argued that it's often not the side of the bigger army, but the side with the better story that wins in today's world. And India must remain the land of the better story. As a country with a thriving mass media and a free press, free to the point of irresponsibility, as some of us know, but with a people whose creative energies are daily encouraged to express themselves in a variety of appealing ways, India has an extraordinary ability to tell stories that are more persuasive and attractive than those of many other countries. And this is not about propaganda. In fact, I would argue it will not work if it's directed from above, least of all by the government, but its impact can be huge. And I'll give you a classic example of this in the national security area, because the obvious objection to everything I'm saying is, how does this help us do anything to protect ourselves or keep ourselves safe or advance our strategic interests? Well, the greatest asset we had in Afghanistan for many, many years, till a couple of years ago, was not military, because we didn't have any soldiers there. We couldn't. It would not have been welcome neither to the international forces nor to the Pakistanis who stood between us and Afghanistan. But the greatest asset we had was for about 7 years, you simply couldn't telephone an Afghan at 8:30 in the evening. Why? Because 92% of Afghan television sets were tuned at 8:30 in the evening to an Indian soap opera, Kyunki Saas Bhi Kabhi Bahu Thi. And it captured the nation's imagination so extraordinarily that it started being blamed by mullahs for people's absences from religious functions. In fact, that's why they eventually succeeded in shutting it down. There were stories of weddings being interrupted for half an hour so people could go and cluster around the TV set and watch the show and then turn their attention to the bride and groom. It became, in a conservative Islamic society where so many social problems and family issues are traditionally hidden behind the veil, it became a tremendous opportunity to discuss family problems openly around this particular show. And while it was on, it became such a major thing. A British news agency, Reuters, I'm not talking about PTI or one of the Indian agencies, did a dispatch from Mazar-e-Sharif about how crime used to go up at 8:30, and he recounted the story, the journalist, of how a vehicle in Mazar-e-Sharif had been stripped of every detachable part, its windshield wipers, its side view mirrors, its hubcaps, its spokes, etc., at 8:30 one evening, and the robbers wrote on the windshield, since Darwan was busy watching television, they wrote on the windshield, "Tulsi Zindabad," in an allusion to the show's heroine. She went on to do other things. I wish she'd stayed with Saas. It would have been so good for the country. Anyway, and there are the question of political values, because yes, I am, after all, as I think Kamala Hassan mentioned in his remarks yesterday, I am a politician, so I will make a political point. When I was not yet a politician, however, and I was traveling for the United Nations in the Arab Gulf countries in 2004, I still remember the mixture of astonishment and admiration with which my Arab interlocutors reacted to the fact that we just had a general election that had been won by a woman political leader of Italian background and Catholic faith, who then made way for a Sikh to be sworn in as prime minister by a Muslim president in a country 81% Hindu. I mean, that, to them, was an extraordinary advertisement for India. And of course, we weren't trying to impress anybody. This was just India being itself. And to my mind, these are the kinds of values that the rest of the world looks at and sees as enhancing our soft power. Just as when Apple or IBM, whichever company it was, uses Mahatma Gandhi in their advertisements. That's a symbol of what this great Indian, as an iconic figure, stands for in the eyes of the world. Because after all, nonviolence, satyagraha, peace, were all users of soft power before the very term had been dreamt of or coined. And India, even after independence in the Nehruvian era, developed a role for itself on the world stage as a voice of the oppressed, the marginalized, the excluded, the colonized, against the big power hegemons of the day, and that too was a huge addition to India's soft power. But of course, the great flaw in all of this was that as the humiliation of the military defeat by China in 1962 demonstrated, if you have soft power, but you don't have hard power, then there are crippling limitations to your place on the world stage. Theodore Roosevelt's famous maxim in this country is, speak softly but carry a big stick and you will go far. We, unfortunately, were speaking loudly and carrying no stick at all. So the challenge is, soft power becomes more credible when there is hard power behind it. And that's why the US has been able to make so much of its soft power. We haven't always. I think you're signaling to me that it's time for the Q&A, is that right? All right, give me a couple of minutes to try and pull this together. I mentioned this as an example. I do tend to get carried away with examples, but it's something that I can talk about in the Q&A, about how little, sadly, we have been able to leverage hard power in the world. And perhaps how much more important and challenging it is to consciously leverage soft power. All the examples I've given you are not deliberate. They're not governmental policy. These are all things that are products of our society and our culture. And they transcend governments, they precede the present government and will outlive it. But the point is still that there's something that government should be conscious of and try to do something positive about. Hard power without soft power will stir up resentment, to be seen as a bully. Soft power without hard power will essentially be seen as, to put it very bluntly, weakness. Now, and we've seen this with other countries too. I mean, whether it's the Russians in Ukraine or the Chinese in Tibet, you can win the hard power battle and lose the soft power war, and that's very, very, very much often, that's very often what happens. There's one crucial point I want to make. We did start a bit late, Ishan, so I think I'll go on for a couple of minutes more. I'm sure the next speaker will forgive me, right? The fact is that at the same time, for us to be credible as a nation that enjoys and wields soft power, we have to fix our own domestic problems first. The truth is that we have to do enough to keep our people healthy, well-fed, and secure not just from jihadi terrorism, but from the daily terror of hunger, poverty, and disease. Now, progress is being made, but not all of it has yet reached everyone. And unless and until we can do that, and whether we grow by, I've forgotten what percentage Chanda was expecting, but whether it's 7 or 9%, the percentage that really matters is those 25% at the bottom of our society whose well-being we simply can't afford to ignore. Without that, without fixing that problem, our soft power will ring hollow at home and abroad. But at the same time, it's not enough just to attend to those basic needs. If India wants to remain a source of attraction to others in the world, we must preserve the precious pluralism that is such a civilizational asset in our globalizing world. I've talked about the value of our political, the attractiveness of our political values on the global stage. It certainly adds to India's soft power when our non-governmental organizations actively defend human rights, promote environmentalism, fight injustice, and it's a vital asset that our press is free, lively, irreverent, and disdainful of sacred cows. But at the same time, it is not so good when women are assaulted in the streets of Delhi and advisories are going out in foreign countries that women should not travel alone to India. It is not good when some people begin to fear that it is safer to be a cow than a Muslim in India today. It is not good when people in the ruling party make outrageous statements against minority communities, which are condoned by the silence of the highest occupants of office in our land. These are not good because they undermine the soft power. A friend of mine who was contemplating a major investment in India wrote to me at a time when there were articles about a tax on churches. Perhaps some of those were debunked later, but the fact is the articles in the media were talking about a land of rampant intolerance and increasing hostility towards minorities. And he said, do you really want me to bring my money into this country? These are the kinds of dangers. So if on the one hand we go around saying make in India and start up India and skill India and we want to attract foreign investors to come here, we cannot do so if we are condoning hate in India at the same time. Now, therefore, part of my battle in politics is to ensure that we acknowledge and celebrate the fact that we are diverse, that we are vast, that we contain multitudes, and that those who have presumptuously taken upon themselves to define what is Bharatiya Sanskriti, what is truly Indian, should be told that they have no business to do so. Nothing is less truly Indian than a narrow definition of what India is all about. From my point of view, to allow any self-appointed arbiters of Indianness to impose their hypocrisy and double standards on the rest of us is to permit them to define Indianness down until it ceases to be Indian. And there could be no worse assault on the soft power that I've celebrated here today. Now, I do want to stress that, of course, the one thing you can always say about India is you can never generalize about India. for every one of these trends, one points to the converse also exists. Everything I tell you about India, the opposite is also true. And so for every sign of rampant intolerance, there's example after example of great tolerance and civilizational coexistence and acceptance of the others. Every negative has a positive, but we need consciously, and I mean from the point of view of the government, deliberately to encourage the positive, accentuate the soft power, and not allow it to be vitiated or undermined by the irresponsibility of some of those who have recently acquired power in the country. And at the same time, accept and celebrate the changes that are happening. Changes in society, in economics, in politics, that in many other developing countries could only have occurred on the backs of a violent revolution. So we have actually made significant progress. And I think that to do this, we need to maintain our soft power. We need to sustain this larger idea of India I described to you at the beginning of my talk. An India that celebrates the common space available to every identity. That you can be secure to be a Muslim, secure to be a Bengali, secure to be a Kayast, whatever way you want to define yourself, because all of those identities are made secure by the sheltering carapace of the Indian identity. And that's why I've often argued that unlike the American melting pot, India is a thali, that it's a collection of different dishes on one steel plate. The dishes are all in different bowls, so they don't necessarily flow into each other or mix, but they belong together on that one plate, and they combine on your palate to give you a satisfying repast. So, remember that the better story is not merely the story you want to tell, it's also the story the world hears, whether or not you're trying to tell it. India is and must remain the land of the better story. We have had a great story to tell. That's what our soft power is built on, that I've tried to share with you today. And I believe we can hold on to it, nurture it, embellish it, and leverage it. India will have an extraordinary asset in its quest for influence and leadership in the world in the 21st century. Thank you, and Jai Hind. I can answer from there. Will you pay traffic cop and pick the questioners?
No. I'll do that.
Because I'm assuming there's a handheld mic in the audience, is there? So then why don't you guys, whoever's wielding the mic, just go and give it to whoever, so that I don't have to pick the questioner. It's a very invidious task for a guest to have.
All of you who have questions, there's a mic.
Oh, it's not a handheld mic, it's a
there's a mic at the bottom of
stationary
each
mic.
aisle, so why don't you come down?
Okay, so come to the stationary mic, and then I guess should we just take it in order, starting left to right and go one by one? Okay, you.
Hi, Mr. Tharoor.
Tell me who you are.
I'm Ravin Nanda. I live in Boston. And I recently saw your speech at the Oxford Union when you addressed the reparations that the British Empire owed to India. And I love that speech so much.
Thank
and
you.
I'm totally inspired by that. And my question to you is, what inspired you to give the speech, to kind of speak the truth about what the British owes?
Well, actually, they invited me to the debate. It's as simple as that. I mean, this is a subject I've cared about for some time. I did my undergraduate honors degree in history. And though I moved on from that, I have always maintained that amateur interest in history. And actually, I was a bit surprised by the extent to which this seemed to open the eyes of people, because I thought this was all Indian nationalism 101. I mean, this is stuff that Dadabhai Naoroji and Ramesh Chandra Dutt was saying in the 19th century, that Jawaharlal Nehru was writing in the 20th century. I actually didn't think, maybe I pulled a lot of different things together in one place and in a short time, which caters to the current attention spans of our audiences. But the fact is that really what I'm saying is not that unusual. However, they invited me to speak on this topic, and I decided to go for it. It's for the jugular. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Avneet, and this is a question which I've been discussing with a lot of people, because India's secret weapon of Mahatma Gandhi's idea of direct nonviolence is actually something we need India needs to put on the table right now to solve world conflict, which is a world necessity at this point because of thermonuclear nations being thermonuclear and also an increased danger of thermonuclear war in many parts of the world. And our own experience, successful experience with that, is something that America today has forgotten. So we need to remind America and the world about that. So I just wanted your comments on that weapon and, as you call, soft power in the world.
You see, I'm a huge admirer of Gandhi, as you are, but the fact is that his technique would only work in certain contexts and certain societies. The strength of what he did in India was to shame an occupier who was capable of being shamed, the British. But when he frighteningly prescribed to the Jews in Hitler's Germany that they should go without protest to the gas chambers, I mean, he just sounds completely out of touch, sadly. I mean, this wasn't going to move Hitler. It was exactly what he wanted them to do, right? So one could argue, for example, today that the Palestinians might do far better marching in tens of thousands unarmed into Israeli lines with all the world's cameras paying attention. That would be a very successful Gandhian ploy. Instead of throwing stones or shooting or setting off bombs, there's an example where perhaps Gandhianism would work very effectively. But how is Gandhianism going to work in Syria, in Iraq, in Libya, in any of the Yemen, some of the conflicts that we are talking about today that the world is grappling with? So it's not a one-size-fits answer to everything. Gandhiji had a number of lessons for the world which go beyond merely the appreciation of nonviolence. I mean, one of his most important ideas as a political thinker was his insistence that means must match ends, that a moral end cannot be justified or pursued through immoral means, something which nobody had argued before him. And in fact, as a result, Martin Luther King was very inspired in this country in the civil rights movement. So you can find examples like that. There are many other lessons we can talk to, at least 3 or 4 come readily to mind, but I realize there are lots of people standing with questions. The short answer is the world already knows what Gandhiji represents, and the admiration for him continues to grow. He will always be, I think, an astonishingly valuable calling card. But if we try and impose Gandhianism in contexts where it's inappropriate or less useful, then, to be honest, I think we'll be doing him and ourselves a disservice. Gandhiji was very, very good at using free media to get his point of view across. It's very important that, why was the Dandi March as long as it was? Because he was collecting media along the way. If he had just gone off, 2 minutes from a bus to the sea and made salt, he would never have had that impact. When you walk day after day after day, and you're stopping and fasting and preaching and praying, and more cameras are coming, more journalists are coming, when you finally get to the sea, that critical mass of media attention is what gave the symbolic power to that act of breaking the salt law. You can do that sort of thing today because the information era permits it and facilitates it. And many are doing it without even realizing they're following a Gandhian tactic. But as I said, you can't apply the principle of nonviolence quite simply to every conflict. It's not realistic.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, sir. I'm Amol, and my question is, you are a member of Indian National Congress, and given today the kind of image Congress has in India, do you have any opinion or views to improve its image?
No, the great problem with ideas of image is they're always formed by others, right? It's the media caricature that constitutes the image and not necessarily the lived reality of the person or the institution whose image is in question. And to my mind, and as somebody whose own image has been grossly tarnished by a large number of lies and distortions about me in the media, I take this issue of image with something of a pinch of salt. I always believe that ultimately your own work, your own words, your own performance is what most people will judge you by. A political party lives on electoral success. We've taken quite a bit of a beating in the last couple of years, and it may even continue for a while. But fortunes always change in politics. And what the Congress has as its strength is it has a deep bench of talent. It is certainly not, as has been caricatured, sort of the most corrupt party in India and so on. It happened to be in power when a number of corrupt wrongdoings were brought to light and the Anna Hazare movement was at its peak. Whoever had been in power would probably have been tarnished by the same brush. It happened to be us at this time. But I would say that the Congress also has a proud record, a proud legacy. It also has values and principles that in many ways are closer to the spirit of what the Indian people really live like and behave. I don't think the Indian people are bigoted. I don't think the Indian people are intolerant. I don't think the Indian people are particularly jingoistic or hostile to people who are not like them. And I think that the Congress Party's espousal of these country values is extremely important. And finally, politically, there is the fact that we do represent an alternative style of leadership. The Congress Party doesn't have one person claiming to know all the answers, claiming to be the great man on the white horse who's going to deliver the nation from all its ills. The Congress Party says, we are present everywhere. We will work on the grassroots. We'll listen to you. We'll hear what you have to say, and together we'll find solutions. That's how India has worked, and I believe after the great slogans and promises and so on have not been fulfilled by the time of the next election, they will turn to those who don't give extraordinary promises, but who do actually deliver transformative results.
But you have never thought of leaving the party and joining some other party?
No, I mean, I will say to you very truthfully that obviously there is not, in a parliamentary system where the party system matters a lot and where our anti-defection law has created the party whip for pretty much every issue and every vote, and there's no real room for disagreement, you have to accept that very often every Indian politician finds himself not always in 100% agreement with his party, either on policy or on tactic, but that part of party discipline is when the party has taken a position, you have no choice but to go along with it. Now, if you ever get to the point where you are simply unable to go along with something, then you would really responsibly feel you should leave. I have not come anywhere close to that perception. There are things on which I've disagreed. Some of my disagreements have become known, not because of me, but because there are lots of people in my party who like leaking things that I have said or written or whatever to show me up, shall we say, and leave it there. But the truth is that the vast majority of things I do agree. I may not be, shall we say, the most archetypal congressman you can find, and certainly I'm new enough to politics that you can cut me some slack there. But at the same time, I would have a broader range of agreement with the policies and principles of the Congress than those of other parties. When I left the UN, all the various tendencies did come to me and ask if I'd be interested in joining them. But I saw, broadly speaking, four choices in the country. So you've either got a party that has two major handicaps. One, it carries an enormous baggage of bigotry, and it thinks India is shining, but it doesn't ask who India is shining for. Then you've got a political tendency that says that they are for the poor, but they obstruct every single progressive economic reform or policy that would actually stop the poor being poor, because if they stopped being poor, they wouldn't vote for these guys. So you've got a third broad set of tendencies, which are the parochial regional parties. So none of those do I have a congenial home in. And finally, you've got the Congress Party, which is the party that liberalized India, is no longer the party of the emergency, which I opposed and wrote about, is no longer the party of state capitalism or state socialism or whatever, which in many ways condemned India to an unnaturally slow rate of growth, which I also wrote against and wrote about. It is now the party of liberalization. It is a part of social liberalism and tolerance. It is the party of free speech. It is the party of pluralism and India that represents all communities, all religions, all interests. And those are things that I value. And it also says we need growth for India to survive and to flourish, but we must distribute the revenues that come from that growth to those who are left out, those who have nothing. And frankly, I agree with that. The logic of the market, which I'm a big believer in, cannot appeal to those who can't afford to enter the marketplace. So we need to have both growth and distribution, social justice. I think the Congress Party stands for that. I'm happy to be there.
Thank you.
Thank
I'm
you.
your fan. Thank you.
In the interest of time, we'll be taking 2 last questions.
First, I'm Dr. Sunil Manjula.
I think there's a gentleman here who's standing longer. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Aditya, and my question to you is, what are your views on the issue of intolerance raised by Amir Khan?
Okay. Yours?
Thank you. That was a wonderful speech. I also come from God's own country. I'm a neurosurgeon here in Boston. My question is, you have been a student in the United States, and all of us in the crowd here have been students here, and we all want to do something for India, work in India, give back to India. But when we come to this country for training, you squeeze the toothpaste till it's thin like a blade. You wear a New Balance shoe over an old socks. Go through all the frugality, and then when you go back to India successful, you carry a Bisleri bottle of water. You ask your nanny to say cheese before the photograph. Is there a sort of changing perspective? We are losing our survival instinct that you are embarrassed to have the porter lift your luggage. You don't go to the TTE for changing reservations. You are like changing perspective or losing that edgy survival instinct. And you are a person who were a diplomat here, live for decades here. You go back to Trivandrum, you connect with the people there. You go to the peasant's home, you go to Shankamugam beach and talk to the poor fishermen. How is that chemistry happening? How do you connect? What is the Shashi Tharoor mantra?
Okay. And the young lady there.
Hi, Shashi. I'm Darshana. I'm also from Thiruvananthapuram, so nice to meet you here. So my question is, what does the government of India have any kind of roadmap to harness soft power of India?
Does the government of India have a roadmap?
Yeah.
Okay. So for the young boy here, I think Amir Khan is a great asset to India. I think he's a very, very fine actor and has done a great deal by and large to promote India, including being a branded ambassador for the Incredible India campaign and so on. I think his comment was taken out of context. I was actually present in the hall when he said what he said. And I think it was simply a reaction to some of the appalling things said about Indian Muslims and minorities by some people in the ruling party who were not rapped on the knuckles or fired as they should have been for those remarks. And you must see what a person stands for and believes in the overall context and not just one soundbite wrenched out of context. Unfortunately, our Indian media's habit is to take the one soundbite and run with it as if it represents the sum total of a complex worldview. I think that's wrong. I think the problem is not that India is intolerant. India is not intolerant. Indian society, Indian civilization is fundamentally tolerant, accepting. We coexist with all sorts of differences, as I've often said. But there are unfortunately people of a certain political tendency promoting a divisive language of intolerance. And unless they are curbed, this can get out of hand. Particularly, we've seen in the lead up to elections and state assemblies and by-elections that a particular party has been using intolerance in order to polarize the electorate and hope to profit from the votes of the majority community. This kind of politics is dangerous for India and should be condemned. So I may not agree with the way in which Amir Khan phrased it, but the substance of the issue and the broader problem must be understood by all of us. On your question, I claim absolutely no magic of any sort. I just when I went to Trivandrum and ran for election, my opponents, the communists had won the 2 previous elections, decided to take the easy way out and attack me for being me. So they basically said, look at this guy, he's a fellow who's only comfortable in suits and ties and sits in air-conditioned offices. What does he know of our problems? Can he even speak our language properly? How can he presume to represent us? And when I went out in the heat, on the hottest days of the year, for 18-hour, 20-hour days of campaigning, wearing a munda and speaking my very simple, colloquial, picked up, not Sahitya Malayalam. And I said to them in my speeches, after speaking for a few minutes in Malayalam, I would say, look, you can see that I have enough Malayalam to understand your hopes and your needs. And more important than my Malayalam, I have the Hindi and English you need to have your voice raised in Delhi, where good Malayalam wouldn't get you very far. So that clicked. Finally, on soft power, I won't take the easy opposition MP way out and say the government has no roadmap for anything. Because in fact, the government is actually full of roadmaps. What it doesn't seem to have is a renovated vehicle to drive on those roads to get us to an identifiable destination. I actually have often said, and been blamed for it and criticized for it, that a lot of what our Prime Minister says makes sense. I think that his diagnosis is actually largely accurate. His speeches are inspiring. He seems to have the right vision. What I fault him for is the complete lack of connectedness between the vision, the speeches, and any actual action on the ground. And so when you see, for example, the Prime Minister standing up and making a speech soon after his election saying in India it takes 200 steps to open a store, whereas in America it only takes 6, and we should come down. We shouldn't have this kind of I mean, I don't know if those numbers are accurate. These are his numbers in one of his speeches. Well, 18, 19 months later, it still takes 200 steps to open a store, because the Prime Minister is great at making the speech, but nobody then goes out and rewrites the regulations that require 200 steps to open a store. And if his government doesn't do it, who's going to do it? So my problem is not the lack of roadmaps. The roadmaps are all there. What we need the government to do is to get the screwdrivers out, the nuts and bolts, renovate that vehicle, make the engine function, put it on that road and take it to the destination. And that I don't see this government doing on any issue so far, including, sadly, on soft power. One honorable exception, yoga. That was a clever governmental initiative, and Mr. Modi personally practices it every day, so maybe he was anxious to see it through effectively, and it was well done. It certainly remains a good calling card for India on the world stage. But, does India only want to be known for something that involves twisting yourself into knots? Or do we want also to move forward and show that we are everything the Prime Minister says we ought to be? That's, I think, up to him and his government to deliver. Thank you all very much. It's been a great pleasure.